Thank you. Originally, I was told I was just coming here to introduce Gary Johnson, but then I was told when I got here that I'm actually expected to talk for a bit. So let me just say a few words about what I think the goal of the Republican Liberty Caucus needs to be. And, you know, I don't think we have another 20 years. You've been around for 20 years, and if we don't make a big difference now, I don't know what this country's going to look like in 20 years, if there'll be a Republican Party in 20 years. But we need to do something in the next year, in the next 2 years. You know, when I ran for the U.S. Senate in Connecticut, one of the things that reporters would always ask me, they said, well, you're not really a Republican. You're a Libertarian, right? And I would say, you know, no, I'm a Republican, and my opponents are really Democrats. And, you know, the reason that a lot of people became Libertarians, because I voted Libertarian for a while, it was because the Republican Party became the Democratic Party. And I think at its heart, the Republican Party is libertarian. The principles are libertarian. The key is to nominate Republican candidates who will actually honor those principles when they are elected. That's the problem. You know, the freshman Congressman West, who gave the keynote address a few hours ago, overall, he gave a pretty good speech. But, you know, the big problem I have with that kind of speech is he went off and he said that the $1 trillion deficits have to stop. And then he bragged about the fact that we're going to cut $100 billion from the deficit, from spending. The federal budget is almost $4 trillion. If we settle for a mere $100 billion in cuts, the $1 trillion deficits that Congressman West said can't continue will continue. In fact, they're going to get bigger. And in fact, when they talk about cuts, they're not even cuts. They're reductions in the rate of increase. Spending still goes up. So if the government is too big right now, how can you brag about making it bigger? We have to take bold action right now. We can't talk about making government smaller. We actually have to make government smaller. And so that means that we have to take a meat cleaver to federal spending. And we need to elect people to office who don't want to be there. Because the problem is we keep sending politicians to Washington and expecting them to act like statesmen. Well, they're not going to. They get there, or they get here, because we're in Washington, and they like it. They want to stay here. They get comfortable, and so they do what they have to do to get along and stay in Washington. We need to break that cycle. And it's not just because I'm talking about it. We are on the verge of a major economic crisis. I said on the verge, it's not over. A lot of people think, oh, the crisis was in 2008. No, the crisis is still coming. It might happen before the 2012 election. And if it doesn't happen before, it will certainly happen very shortly thereafter. But it is very important that we win this ideological battle. Because the problem is, the reason that we had the events of 2008 wasn't because the government was too small, but because it was too big. It wasn't a failure of capitalism. It was a failure of socialism. It was government that created the problems. And, you know, when I wrote my book, Crash Proof, to lay out what was going to happen, the events of 2008 were the crisis. I predicted those events, but I predicted that they would usher in the crisis. I saw the housing bubble, and I knew that when that bubble burst, that banks would fail, that Freddie and Fannie would fail. I knew that we would have the greatest recession since the Great Depression. I knew that it would last for years. I knew that unemployment would go into the double digits. But that wasn't the crisis that I foresaw. The crisis that I foresaw was what the government would do in response to that. The crisis was the bailouts and the stimulus. See, I was opposed to the bailouts before there was anybody to bail out, because I knew it was coming. I knew that when the housing bubble burst, that they would resort to the identical policies that inflated it. I knew that the Federal Reserve would slash the interest rates in response to the recession, and in fact, Ben Bernanke has acted even more recklessly than his predecessor, Alan Greenspan. We have 0% interest rates. I knew that we would open up the Keynesian playbook, and then we would try to deficit spend our way out of this recession. And since I knew the enormity of the downturn, I knew that the next round of stimulus would actually kill the economy, because it was the stimulus that caused the stock market bubble. It was government stimulus that caused the housing bubble. And we are now going to overdose on that stimulus. We now have a government bubble of gigantic proportion. And the next crisis that's coming is a far greater crisis. If you look around and you look at Ireland and you look at Greece, that's what's coming. A sovereign debt crisis, a currency crisis. You know, there are people that are saying that, oh, no, it's not going to happen in America. The problem is contained to Greece and Ireland and these few countries. I've heard that one before. I've seen that movie. That's what they said about subprime. Right? It was contained. Don't worry about it. Oh, it's not going to affect the prime market. Well, when people were making those assurances, I was out there on television saying that's not the case. See, I knew it wasn't about the contagion spreading. I knew that the entire market already had the disease. It was just that in the subprime sector, that's where you saw the symptoms first. But I knew it was a matter of time before the rest of the mortgage market succumbed to that disease. That's the same thing. We made the same mistakes as Greece. We made the same mistakes as Ireland. The difference is they don't issue the reserve currency. We do, for now. But if you look at the comments of Alan Greenspan that he made here in Washington to Congress last week and in a press conference 2 days earlier, we're not going to have the reserve currency much longer. Alan Greenspan is lying about the rate of inflation. Inflation is a serious problem that is getting worse, and it's serious because Ben Bernanke is creating it. Right now we're creating inflation and exporting it all around the world. And the effects of it are undermining the economies of those countries that are propping up our currency. But the reason that Ben Bernanke has to lie and claim there's no inflation is because if he acknowledges that there's inflation, then he has to do something about it. But he can't. Because the minute he raises interest rates, this phony economic expansion will come to a halt. And he knows that. See, people talk about that the U.S. economy is recovering. We're not recovering from anything. Yes, the GDP numbers are rising, and yes, we've stopped hemorrhaging jobs, but why? Because we've borrowed and printed trillions of dollars and spent it. So we got to a financial crisis that was the result of excess borrowing and excess spending. And what was our solution? Borrow more and spend more. And so all we've done is we've dug ourselves into a deeper hole. We have bought a few years of phony prosperity, but at great cost. See, we did the same thing when George Bush was first elected. When he inherited a bursting stock market bubble from Clinton, what did we do? Well, the same thing. We stimulated with cheap money, we deficit spent, and the consequence was a housing bubble. And that bought us 4 or 5 years of phony economic growth. And the consequences happened in 2008. But then, once again, the government did not allow the market to correct those imbalances and those mistakes. The mistake wasn't the recession of 2008. The mistake was the phony boom that made that recession necessary. We needed to solve those mistakes. But instead of solving them, Barack Obama and Ben Bernanke are making them worse. But what we have to remember is who handed Barack Obama that big government Keynesian baton. It was George Bush. All this stimulus started under a Republican. It's the same philosophy. It's the same playbook. We need somebody to have an opposing ideology. Because what happens is whenever the government gets involved in the free market, and so it's not free, and because of government involvement, because of mandates and regulations and subsidies, we do a lot of foolish things. We make a lot of mistakes. Stimulus is like alcohol, right? And when you drink alcohol, you do stupid things. I know. And when you sober up, you go, how can I be so stupid? Well, the government doesn't want us sobering up because they want us to keep making these mistakes. Because unfortunately, to acknowledge how big the problem is, then you have to acknowledge how difficult the solutions are going to be. But the solutions they're not hard, right? They keep talking about we have to make hard choices. They're really simple. See, what's hard, it's hard for politicians to do it. Because if they do the right thing, they might not get reelected. See, that's the tough choice we're talking about. Should I do the right thing or try to get reelected? See, we need to send people for whom that's an easy choice. They don't care if they get reelected. They just want to do the right thing. But the problem is, as I digress, and now I remember what I wanted to say, when the government pollutes capitalism and the consequences are misallocations of resources, booms and busts, and you have a big bust, it's always capitalism that gets the blame, even though it's the government that caused the problem. And then what happens? Government uses that crisis as an excuse to get even bigger. In fact, they had a commission, government commission, that just introduced their findings, so I put that word in quotes. They had to look into the cause of the financial crisis. Now, of course, they didn't care what the cause was. They just wanted to blame it on a lack of regulation. So, did they call anybody to testify at that commission who actually forecast the crisis? No. I tried. I contacted the Republicans in the committee to see if I could testify. I said, I wrote a book predicting the crisis. I'm all over the television predicting the crisis. I'm speaking at economic conferences all around the world as the guy that called the crisis. I'll go to Washington for free and tell you exactly why we had it. In fact, I said, you don't even need a commission. You can just buy my book on Amazon. It's like $16, and you'll know why we had crisis. But, no. The only people that were asked to testify were the people who were going to support the government narrative that we had an economic crisis because we didn't have enough regulation. And so what's the solution? We need more government regulation. So since this next economic collapse is going to be so severe, and I'll tell you how it's going to unfold, because it's already started. Look at the yields on the Treasury bonds rising. Look at the yield on the 10-year. And realize, too, that we had an auction of Treasury bonds this week for 10 years. And 71% of those bonds were bought by foreign central banks, an all-time record. What would happen if those foreign central banks weren't there? Because one day, they won't be there. Right? Because the only way to put an end to inflation in China is to stop printing RMB. And if they stop printing RMB, they can't buy those treasuries. They can't buy our debt. They can't put an end to their inflation until they stop importing it from us. And when they stop importing it from us, it's got no place to go. It stays right here. And then all the money that they print, right, we're not sending that money to China. It stays right here, bidding prices through the roof. And interest rates will follow. And we are very close. And you have to realize that when I said earlier that our phony economic expansion depends on cheap money, Ben Bernanke knows he can't raise rates. Because if he raises rates, what happens to all those adjustable rate mortgages? If we have a bad housing market now, imagine what happens then. What happens to all these banks that we bailed out? What happens to these banks that have portfolios of long-term government bonds and mortgages that are paying 4 or 5%? The only reason these banks are afloat is because they're borrowing from the Fed for nothing and loaning to the Treasury at 4%. Well, what happens if rates go up to 5%? They're all bankrupt, every one of them. What happens to the federal government? The national debt is twice what it was 10 years ago, but the interest cost on that debt is less than it was 10 years ago. Well, how do we manage that? How do we pull that rabbit out of our hat? Well, we did something that a lot of people did who bought houses they couldn't afford. Right? We took out a teaser rate on the national debt. We got like a subprime mortgage. The maturity on the national debt is extremely short. Am I running out of time? All right. But anyway, so when interest rates rise, and they will, all of a sudden the cost of servicing the national debt is going to skyrocket. We don't have the money. Right? That's what happened in Ireland. Ireland's debt wasn't a problem until interest rates rose and they couldn't afford the payment. So that day of reckoning is coming for the United States. It might happen in 2011, maybe it happens in 2012, but it's coming. And we need to have nominees of this party that understand, that can articulate the free market solutions to these government problems, and that are actually going to have the courage to do something about those problems when they get elected, regardless of the political consequences for themselves. I know one person that has a history of making those tough choices, regardless of consequences, is the next speaker, former Governor Gary Johnson.